Ruby Carter's knees hit the dirt before she even realized she'd stopped running. She didn't cry out. She just pulled Noah tighter against her chest, pressed her cracked lips to his forehead, and whispered, "Almost there. Almost." She had said that for 3 miles, maybe 4. She'd lost count somewhere after the second river crossing. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and follow Ruby's fight to the very end. And drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer heat in Harlan County, Montana had a weight to it, not just warmth but pressure, the kind that settled on your shoulders and didn't let go. By mid-July, the grasslands went the color of old straw, and the creek beds cracked down the middle like busted leather. The sky turned white before noon and stayed that way until dusk swallowed it whole. Ethan Walker had been mending the east fence since before sunup. He worked the way he did most things, quietly, methodically, without complaint. He was 34 years old, built lean and deliberate, with hands that had learned the difference between patience and resignation somewhere around his 25th year. He'd bought the Broken Spur Ranch with money he'd saved working cattle drives up from Texas, and he'd spent the better part of a decade turning it into something worth keeping. He wasn't a man who invited conversation. The nearest town, Millhaven, was 11 miles east, and Ethan made the trip once a week, maybe twice if supplies ran short. People respected him the way they respected a fence post, solid, necessary, and unlikely to start anything. He heard her before he saw her. Not words, not a scream, just a sound low and ragged, more animal than human, coming from somewhere past the South Ridge. Ethan set down his wire cutters. He stood still for a moment, listening. The wind moved through the grass. A hawk turned lazy circles overhead. Then the sound came again, closer now, desperate, and Ethan was already moving. She came over the ridge at a stagger, one arm wrapped around a child pressed flat to her chest, the other hand clutching a fence post like it was the only thing between her and the ground. She was 12 years old, though she carried herself like someone who'd aged out of childhood a long time ago. Her dress was torn at the hem and dark with sweat along the collar. Her boots, men's boots too big for her feet, had rubbed her heels raw. One of them was bleeding through the leather. The baby on her hip was maybe 2 years old, limp with heat and exhaustion, his small face pressed into her neck. He wasn't crying. That was the part that scared Ethan most. Children that age were supposed to cry. "Hey!" Ethan started toward her. She saw him, and her whole body lurched backward, nearly losing her balance. She gripped the fence post harder. Her eyes dark, sharply intelligent, wide, with something that was equal parts terror and calculation, fixed on him like she was measuring the distance between them and deciding whether she could run. "I ain't gonna hurt you," Ethan said. He stopped moving, held both hands out, palms open. "I ain't going anywhere near you till you say it's all right." She stared at him. Her chest was heaving. The baby made a small, weak sound against her neck, and her arm tightened automatically, instinctively. "Your boy?" Ethan asked. "My brother," she said. Her voice was hoarse, like she'd been talking for hours, or maybe not at all. "His name is Noah. He's 2. She paused, swallowed hard. "He's got a fever." Ethan didn't say anything. He just looked at the child, the flush across his cheeks, the way his small fingers curled limp at his sides, and then he looked back at the girl. "You walk far?" he asked. "Far enough." She lifted her chin. "I need water for him. That's all I'm asking. Water, and maybe somewhere to sit him down in the shade for a spell. Then we'll go." "Go where?" She didn't answer that. "What's your name?" Ethan asked. A beat of silence. Ruby Carter." "Ethan Walker?" He nodded toward the ranch house behind him. "I got a well and a covered porch. Come on." She didn't move. "I told you," he said, keeping his voice flat and easy. "I ain't going to hurt you, but that boy needs water, and he needs it now, and you look like you're about 30 seconds from going down yourself. So you can stand here and decide whether or not to trust me, or you can come get your brother some water. Your call, Miss Carter." Something shifted in her face. Not trust, not yet. But maybe the recognition that she didn't have enough left in her to say no. She followed him. Ethan's housekeeper. A stout widow named Mrs. Paulson, who came 3 mornings a week, had already gone home by the time he got Ruby and Noah to the porch. He was glad for it. Ruby was watching everything with those sharp, measuring eyes, and he had the sense that too many people at once would spook her. He drew water from the well cool and deep and handed her a tin cup. She drank fast, too fast, then caught herself and slowed down the way someone does when they've learned the hard way that a starved stomach doesn't forgive excess. She filled the cup again and held it to Noah's lips, coaxing him in small sips, murmuring something low against his hair that Ethan didn't try to hear. Ethan went inside and came back with bread and cold beef from the morning and set it on the porch rail without comment. He sat himself down on the step below the bench she'd taken, leaning his elbows on his knees, giving her space. "He been sick long?" Ethan asked, nodding toward Noah. "Since yesterday afternoon." Ruby kept her eyes on her brother. "He was fine in the morning. Then the heat got bad and he stopped wanting water and started burning up." Her jaw set. "I knew I had to move faster." "Where'd you start from?" She hesitated again. That hesitation was starting to tell Ethan things she wasn't saying out loud. "Cimarron Creek," she said finally. Ethan looked at her. "That's 15 miles. I know how far it is. You walked 15 miles in July heat carrying a 2-year-old. "Yes." Her eyes came up to meet his for the first time. They were steady. "I did." Ethan looked away first. He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it back down. "Your folks know where you are?" he asked. The quiet that followed that question was different from the others, heavier with something raw underneath it. "My mama died 2 winters back," Ruby said. "Fever. My daddy—" She stopped. Started again. "My daddy died in April. Horse threw him. He hit his head on a rock by the Miller Creek crossing." Her voice didn't waver, but her hand found the back of Noah's neck and stayed there. "It was just us after that." "Just you and Noah?" "Yes, sir." "Who's been looking after you since April?" Ruby's mouth went thin. "Our uncle, Victor Hale." She said the name the way you'd say a word you didn't like the taste of. "He's our daddy's brother. He rode out from Billings about 2 weeks after the funeral. Said it was his duty to look after us, and the property." She paused. "He didn't mean us. He meant the property." Ethan waited. "My daddy owned 160 acres along the Yellowstone tributary," Ruby said. "Good land. Timber a spring-fed pond and a 1/4 mile of creek frontage." She'd clearly said these words before precisely like she'd practiced them. "Victor's been trying to get legal control over it since before the ground dried over Daddy's grave. He found a lawyer in Billings, a man named Crowder, who helped him file papers saying Noah and I couldn't manage the estate and that Victor should be appointed our legal guardian." She looked at Ethan hard. "Not because he cares about us, because once he's our guardian, he controls the land." "You sure about that?" Ethan asked, not doubting her, testing how sure she was. "I found the letters," she said flatly. "Between Victor and Crowder. Victor wrote that once the guardianship was settled and the children were dealt with, he'd sign over timber rights to Crowder as payment. The children were dealt with." She repeated it quietly like she wanted Ethan to understand exactly what those words meant. "That's what we are to him. Something to be dealt with." The wind moved through the porch eaves. Noah had gone slack against Ruby's side, and she shifted him gently onto the bench beside her, keeping one hand against his chest. "You run," Ethan said. I ran. She looked out at the yard. "Victor came home drunk last night and told me the judge had set a hearing date, said in 3 days everything would be settled legal and proper and there wasn't a thing I could do to stop it. He was laughing." Her voice dropped. "He was laughing, and Noah was right there in the room." "So you took your brother and walked 15 miles. I didn't know where else to go." For the first time something cracked in her voice, just a small fracture quickly sealed. "The families in Cimarron Creek, most of them owe Victor money or rent from him. There ain't nobody in that town who'd put themselves between us and him." She looked at Ethan directly. "I didn't know about you specifically. I just knew the Broken Spur was the farthest ranch from town that wasn't already connected to Victor somehow. I figured a stranger might help, or a stranger might not. But a stranger couldn't be worse than what I was leaving. Ethan was quiet for the long moment. He looked at Noah, the child's labored breathing, the flush high on his round cheeks. "He needs a doctor," Ethan said. "I know that. Dr. Calloway's in Millhaven. I can ride there before dark and bring him back tonight." Ruby stiffened. "Victor will be looking for us by morning. If you go to Millhaven—" "Calloway doesn't answer to Victor Hale," Ethan said. "He doesn't answer to anybody. He's the most ornery man in 3 counties, and he likes it that way." He stood up. "You and Noah stay on this porch. Don't go near the road. I'll be back before the stars come full out." "Why?" Ruby asked. Ethan looked at her. "Why what? Why are you doing this?" There was no accusation in it. She genuinely wanted to know. "You don't know us. We showed up bleeding on your fence. You don't owe us anything." Ethan picked up his hat from the rail, settled it on his head. "No," he said. "I don't." He looked down at Noah. "But he's 2 years old, and he's got a fever, and you carried him 15 miles to keep him safe." He met her eyes. "That counts for something with me, Miss Carter." He was already down the porch steps before she said anything else. "Mr. Walker?" Her voice stopped him. He turned. "There's a man in Millhaven named Dade, Sadler. He's Victor's. If he sees you riding in asking for a doctor, he'll send word." She paused. "I just thought you should know." Ethan looked at her for a moment. Something moved through his expression, not quite a smile, but close to it. "I know Dade," he said. "He owes me $40 from a poker hand last spring." He put 2 fingers to the brim of his hat. "I reckon I can keep him occupied." He came back with Dr. Calloway at 9:30. The doctor was 63, white-bearded, and moved with the deliberate economy of a man who had delivered bad news in enough kitchens to know that rushing didn't help it. He took one look at Noah, asked Ruby 3 questions in rapid succession, and then spent the next 40 minutes working quietly while Ruby sat 2 feet away and didn't move. "Fever's high, but it's responsive," Calloway said finally. He'd gotten fluids into the child cool cloths on his neck and wrists, a measured dose of medication from his bag. "Heat exhaustion complicated by dehydration. He's young, and he was strong before this. Another few hours in that sun without water." He stopped, looked at Ruby. "You made the right call, getting him out of it when you did." Ruby nodded. Her hands were locked together in her lap. "You need looking at too," Calloway said to her. "I'm fine. Your heels are bleeding through your boots, your lips are cracked down to the quick, and you've got rope burn on your left palm from whatever you grabbed onto coming over that ridge." He opened his bag again. "Sit still." She sat still. Ethan stood near the doorway out of the way. He watched the doctor work, and he watched Ruby, the rigid set of her shoulders, the way she kept one eye on Noah, no matter what Calloway was doing to her hands. She didn't flinch once. When Calloway finished, he found Ethan in the hall. "The girl tell you who she is," the doctor said low and direct. "Ruby Carter, Thomas Carter's daughter." Calloway's expression shifted. "You know about the guardianship hearing?" "She told me. Victor Hale's been buying favor in that courthouse for 6 weeks, Calloway said. "Judge Renner is a careful man, but he's also a practical one, and Victor's got a lawyer from Billings who knows how to make legal paperwork look like the only reasonable option." He looked past Ethan toward the room where Ruby sat. "That girl walks back into that county, she walks into a trap." "She ain't walking back into anything," Ethan said. Calloway studied him. "You sure about that Victor's not a man who accepts inconvenience quietly?" "No," Ethan said. "I expect he's not." He looked at the doctor steadily. "You ride back into Millhaven tonight, Doc, and someone asks if you saw anything out this direction." "I've been practicing medicine for 38 years, Calloway said mildly. "I've made a great many house calls. I don't generally recall the details." He picked up his bag. "Noah should sleep through the night. The fever should break before dawn. Keep the boy cool and keep fluids in him." He moved toward the door. "And Mr. Walker?" "Yeah, those letters the girl mentioned. The ones between Hale and the lawyer." Calloway paused at the threshold. If they exist, and I believe they do, they'd change everything in that courtroom. A judge like Renner doesn't want to be on the wrong side of documented fraud. He nodded once. Something to consider. He was gone before Ethan could answer. Ethan went back to the room. Ruby had pulled the chair directly beside the bed where Noah slept. Her boots were off her feet, wrapped in the clean bandaging Calloway had applied. She looked up when Ethan came in. "He said the fever should break," Ethan said. "I heard." She looked down at Noah's face. In the lamplight, the flush in his cheeks had already gentled some. "He looks better." "He does." Silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, just present. "Those letters?" Ethan said. "You said you found them. Where are they now?" Ruby looked at him. For a long moment she didn't speak. Then she reached into the front of her dress and pulled out a folded square of paper, thin, worn at the creases, clearly handled many times. She held it out. Ethan took it, unfolded it carefully, read it slowly. His expression didn't change much, but something in his jaw tightened. "Once the guardianship is settled and the children dealt with, the timber rights along the eastern boundary, no less than 60 acres, will be conveyed in full to your firm as agreed. Hale will ensure the property transfer occurs within 30 days of the court's decision." He folded the letter, held it. "You been carrying that the whole way?" he asked. "Since I found it," she said. 3 weeks ago." He handed it back. She tucked it away again, quick and practiced. "Victor's going to come looking," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Ethan said. "And when he does, we'll be ready." She looked at him. Really looked at him the way she had at the fence, that measuring quality, like she was weighing something important. "You keep saying we," she said, "like it's already decided." Ethan pulled the spare chair to the other side of Noah's bed and sat down. "It is," he said simply. Ruby was quiet for a moment. Then very quietly, "You don't even know us." "I know enough." He looked at Noah sleeping. "Your daddy sounds like he was a decent man." "He was the best man I ever knew." "Then his children deserve better than what Victor Hale has planned for them." He leaned back. "Get some sleep, Miss Carter. Noah's going to need you sharp tomorrow." She looked like she wanted to argue. Instead, she pulled her knees up to her chest in the chair, rested her cheek against them, and kept her eyes on her brother. She was asleep in 10 minutes. Ethan stayed where he was. He didn't sleep. He sat in the lamplight and thought about a lawyer named Crowder, and a judge named Renner, and a man named Victor Hale, who had looked at 2 orphaned children and seen a transaction. Outside, the Montana summer night hummed and clicked and breathed. The heat had eased some. Not much, but some. Victor Hale would come. Ethan didn't doubt it for a moment. He just intended to be there when he did. Noah's fever broke just before dawn. Ruby felt it happen the exact moment the heat drained out of him, the way his small body went from rigid and burning to soft and damp all at once. She had her hand pressed flat against his forehead, and she felt it like a door swinging open. She didn't make a sound. She just pressed her lips together and breathed slow through her nose until she was sure she wasn't going to fall apart. Ethan was still in the chair across from her. He hadn't slept either. He looked up when she exhaled. "It broke," she said. He nodded once. Good. That was all. It was enough. Noah slept on through the early morning, his breathing steady and even, his color coming back in slow degrees. Ruby watched him until the light through the window went from gray to gold, and she could hear movement in the kitchen. Mrs. Paulson arriving, the clank of a stove grate, the smell of coffee threading under the door. Ruby stood up. Her legs were stiff, and her heels screamed when she put weight on them, but she stood. She tucked the blanket more firmly around Noah's shoulders and turned to find Ethan already on his feet. "Mrs. Paulson won't say anything," he said, reading the question on her face before she asked it. "She's not a woman who talks." "How do you know she won't go to Victor?" "Because Victor Hale bought up her late husband's grain debt 2 years ago and called it in the month after the funeral," Ethan said. "She knows exactly what kind of man he is." Ruby absorbed that, filed it away. How many people in this county does Victor have something on? Ethan looked at her steadily. More than he should, he said. Less than he thinks. She followed him to the kitchen. Mrs. Paulson was a broad-shouldered woman in her late 50s with iron gray hair pinned so tight it looked like it hurt. She turned from the stove when they came in, looked at Ruby at the bandaged feet, the torn dress, the dark circles under sharp eyes, and didn't ask a single question. She set a plate of eggs and biscuits on the table and poured 2 cups of coffee and went back to her work. Ruby sat down. She ate the way she'd drunk the water the night before, carefully at first, then faster when her body overruled her caution. She hadn't eaten since the morning before she ran. "There's a change of clothes in the back room," Mrs. Paulson said, not turning around. "Belong to my niece. She left them last summer. They'll fit well enough." Ruby looked up. "Thank you, ma'am." Mrs. Paulson made a sound that wasn't quite a word and kept working. Ethan drank his coffee standing up, the way men who spend most of their lives outdoors tend to drink it fast and practical. He set the cup down and looked at Ruby. "I need to ride into Millhaven this morning." Ruby's hand stopped moving. "I told you." "Not for the doctor this time," he said. "There's a man there I need to talk to. Name's Whitfield. James Whitfield. He's a lawyer." "Victor has a lawyer." "Victor has Crowder," Ethan said. "Crowder works for money. Whitfield works for something else." He paused. "He was the one who helped the Dunbar family 3 years back when the railroad tried to take their land through eminent domain. He lost that case twice before he won it. He's not a man who quits easy." Ruby set her fork down. "And you think he'd help us?" "I think he'd want to read that letter you've been carrying in your dress for 3 weeks, Ethan said. "After that, it's up to him." She was quiet for a moment. The letter. The thing she'd guarded across 15 miles of summer heat, tucked against her skin like a second heartbeat. "If Victor finds out, we have it." "Victor already knows you ran," Ethan said. "He knows you took something. He's going to come regardless." He looked at her directly. "The letter is the only thing that gives us any ground to stand on in that courtroom. Right now, it's just evidence. But in Whitfield's hands, it becomes a weapon." Ruby looked at her plate. She thought about Victor the night before laughing in the kitchen, whiskey loose certain. 3 days little girl, and everything settled legal and proper. She reached into the front of her dress and set the folded letter on the table. Ethan didn't pick it up right away. He looked at it, then at her. "You sure?" "Take it," she said, "before I change my mind." He picked it up and tucked it inside his vest. "I'll be back by midday, and if someone in Millhaven sees you and sends word to Victor..." Ethan pulled his hat from the peg by the door. "Then Victor hears I paid a social call to a lawyer," he said. "That ain't a crime." He settled the hat on his head. "You and Noah stay inside today. Don't go near the windows that face the road." He was out the door before she could argue. Mrs. Paulson refilled her coffee without being asked. Ruby wrapped both hands around the cup and stared at the door long after it had swung shut. She was 12 years old, and she had just handed the only leverage she owned to a man she'd known for less than 12 hours. She decided not to think too hard about what that meant. Noah woke up an hour later asking for water. Ruby was at his side before he'd finished the sentence. She helped him sit up, held the cup steady while he drank, and watched his face for signs of the fever trying to come back. His eyes were clearer, his color was better. He looked at her with the particular bewilderment of a 2-year-old who has woken up in an unfamiliar room and cannot quite decide whether to be alarmed. "This ain't home," he said. "No baby," Ruby said. "It ain't." "Where's home?" She smoothed his hair back. "We're working on that," she said. He accepted this with the philosophical ease of the very young, spotted a wooden horse on the shelf across the room, and immediately wanted to get down and reach it. Ruby let him. She stood in the doorway and watched him toddle across the floor, steady on his feet. Now nothing remaining of last night's crisis except the faint flush that would probably fade by noon. She let herself feel the relief for exactly 30 seconds. Then she went back to thinking. The hearing was in 2 days. Victor had a lawyer and a judge he'd been working for 6 weeks, and a legal filing that said Ruby and Noah needed a guardian. What they had was one letter and a rancher who hadn't turned them away. It wasn't much, but it was more than they'd had yesterday morning. Mrs. Paulson appeared in the doorway beside her, wiping her hands on her apron. She watched Noah wrestle the wooden horse off the shelf with an expression that was carefully neutral. "The boy's got his strength back," she said. "Yes, ma'am." A pause. Then, without looking at Ruby, "Victor Hale came through Millhaven 4 weeks ago, bought drinks at the saloon for half the men in town, and told anybody who'd listen that he'd be settling some family business out at Cimarron Creek." Mrs. Paulson's voice was flat and even. He used the word settling 3 times in one sentence. Men like that, they always think the law is just a formality they have to get through before they get what they want. Ruby looked at her. "You knew him before Victor." "I knew his type." Mrs. Paulson finally looked at her. Her eyes were pale blue and very direct. "Mr. Walker doesn't do things for show. If he's writing to Whitfield, it's because he thinks there's a real chance." She paused. "Don't waste it being afraid." Ruby held her gaze. "I'm not afraid," she said. And the strange thing was, mostly she meant it. Fear required uncertainty, and Ruby had been certain about Victor Hale for 3 weeks. What she felt now was something closer to cold determination. "I'm thinking." Mrs. Paulson made that same not-quite-a-word sound. But this time Ruby thought she heard approval in it. Ethan came back at 11:30, which was earlier than he'd said, and the fact that he was moving fast when he came through the door told Ruby something had happened. "Whitfield will take the case," he said. He didn't sit down. He stood in the center of the kitchen, and his jaw was set in a way Ruby was starting to recognize the way it got when he was controlling something he didn't want to show. He read the letter twice, and then he read it a 3rd time, and then he looked at me and said, "This is suborning fraud and conspiracy to commit property theft, and I have not seen a cleaner case of it in 22 years of practice." Ruby felt something loosen in her chest. He said that. Ethan pulled out a chair and sat. "He also said we need to get Ruby in front of Judge Renner before Victor does. The hearing's set for day after tomorrow. Whitfield is filing a motion tonight to present new evidence and request that Ruby be permitted to give testimony." He looked at her. "That means you'd have to speak. In the courtroom. About everything." The looseness in her chest tightened back up. "I can do that. It won't be easy. Crowder will cross-examine you. He'll try to make you look like a child who doesn't understand what she's talking about." "I am a child," Ruby said. "I understand exactly what I'm talking about." Something crossed Ethan's face fast and hard to name, but Ruby thought it looked like the beginning of pride. "Whitfield also said." Ethan paused, looked at his hands. "There's something else. Something I need to tell you, and I need you to hear it straight." Ruby went still. "What?" "Victor filed an amended petition this morning." He met her eyes. "He told the court you ran because you're unstable. He said you've been behaving erratically since your father's death, and that your disappearance with Noah proves you're not fit to care for your brother and that it supports his claim for guardianship." Ethan's voice was level, but his hands were flat on the table in the way of a man holding something down. "He told them you stole Noah." The kitchen went very quiet. Ruby heard Noah in the next room rolling the wooden horse across the floor, making small engine sounds with his mouth. "He said I stole my own brother," she said. "Yes." She looked at the window. Something moved through her face, not the crack she'd shown last night, but something older and harder, like a fault line that had been there a long time and was simply becoming visible. "Of course he did," she said quietly. "Of course." "Ruby, he's a careful man," she said. "I always knew that. He's not just greedy, he's smart about it." She brought her eyes back to Ethan. "What does Whitfield say?" "He says it makes the letter more important, not less. If Victor is already trying to frame your escape as erratic behavior, it means he's worried. It means he knows there's a risk." Ethan leaned forward. "A desperate man files amended petitions the morning after his target disappears. A confident man waits for his court date." Ruby thought about that. "He came home drunk," she said slowly. "The night I ran. He was drunk and he was laughing and he told me the date. He didn't have to tell me that. He told me because he thought it was already over." She looked at Ethan. "He thought I had nowhere to go." "He was wrong," Ethan said. "He'll figure that out soon." She straightened in her chair. "How long before he comes here?" "His man Dade saw me ride into Millhaven this morning," Ethan said. "So tonight at the latest." Mrs. Paulson, who had been quietly washing dishes for the last 10 minutes, set a pan down in the basin with a definitive clank. "Then we'd best be ready," she said, in the tone of a woman who had already decided what needed doing, and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. Ethan looked at her. "Clara," he said the first time Ruby had heard him use her name, "you don't have to be part of this." Mrs. Paulson picked up the pan again and kept washing. "My husband's debt," she said, "was $340. Victor Hale called it in on a Tuesday. My husband had died on a Saturday." She scrubbed the pan with particular deliberateness. "I am part of this, Mr. Walker. I have been for 2 years. She set the pan in the drying rack. "Now, what do we need to do?" The three of them sat at the table and made a plan. It wasn't a complicated plan. Ethan didn't believe in complicated plans. And Ruby had learned early that the most elegant solution was usually the most direct one. Whitfield would file his motion tonight and request an emergency hearing first thing tomorrow morning, a full day ahead of Victor's scheduled court date. Ethan would ride into Millhaven tonight with Ruby's testimony written out in her own hand, every detail of Victor's behavior. The letter, the conversations she'd overheard, the timeline from her father's death to the moment she ran. Whitfield would use it to demonstrate that her flight was not erratic behavior, but a calculated response to documented threat. Ruby wrote for 2 hours straight. She sat at the kitchen table with paper Ethan pulled from a desk in the back room, and she wrote in the careful, precise hand her father had spent 3 years teaching her, and she did not leave anything out. She wrote about the night Victor arrived with his saddlebags and his smooth words. She wrote about the locked room where he kept his papers, and the afternoon she'd found the window latch loose. She wrote about the letter word for word, because she had read it so many times it lived behind her eyes. She wrote about the way Victor looked at Noah, not with warmth, not even with the detached practicality of a man doing a reluctant duty, but with the focused calculation of someone who saw a problem to be managed. She wrote, "My brother Noah Carter is 2 years old. He cannot speak for himself. I am speaking for him. Everything in this account is true. I will swear to it on any Bible in any courtroom in the state of Montana." She signed her name. Ethan read it without speaking. When he finished, he refolded the pages and put them with the letter inside his vest. "This is good," he said. "This is very good." "Will it be enough?" Ruby asked. "I don't know," he said. "But it's the truth told clearly by someone who was there." He stood up. "That matters, regardless of what Crowder tries to do to it." He rode for Millhaven an hour before sundown. The evening came on slow and thick, the way summer evenings did in Montana, full of sound and heat, that didn't know it was supposed to be fading. Mrs. Paulson stayed. She didn't make a production of it, just put her coat on the hook instead of pulling it down, and started on supper like it was the most natural thing in the world. Ruby didn't say anything about it. She was grateful in the way you're grateful for things you couldn't have asked for. Noah ate well. He'd discovered that Mrs. Paulson's apron pocket sometimes contained biscuit pieces, and he had attached himself to her left side with the single-minded loyalty of the very young and the very opportunistic. Ruby watched him follow the woman from counter to stove and back again, and felt something in her relax by one small careful degree. She was sitting on the front step in the last of the daylight when she heard the horses. Not one horse, several. She was inside with the door shut and Noah in her arms before the sound had fully resolved itself. Mrs. Paulson turned from the stove. Her face had gone careful and still. "How many?" the woman asked. Ruby had already moved to the side of the front window, pressing herself against the wall. She looked through the corner of the glass. 4 riders. coming up the ranch road at a walk, the deliberate pace of men who weren't in a hurry because they didn't think they needed to be. Victor Hale rode in the front. He looked exactly as Ruby remembered him, heavy-set, well-dressed by the standards of a man who wanted people to know he had money, with a face that was broad and pleasant-seeming until you looked at his eyes. His eyes had always reminded Ruby of a very calm, very patient snake. He hadn't brought Crowder. He'd brought 3 men she didn't recognize, and they rode the way men ride when they're being paid to make a point. "It's him," Ruby said. Her voice came out flat and steady, and she was glad for that. Mrs. Paulson moved to the fireplace and lifted something from above the mantel. It was a shotgun, old double-barreled and clearly well-maintained. She cracked it open, checked it, closed it with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. "Mr. Walker is not here," she said in the tone of someone establishing facts. "But this house is not undefended." She looked at Ruby. "Stay back with the boy." "Mrs. Paulson." "I have dealt with harder men than Victor Hale," the woman said calmly, "and I am still standing." She moved to the door. "Stay back." Victor Hale's voice came from the yard loud and easy, with the particular confidence of a man who expected to be obeyed. "Hello, the house. I'm looking for my niece and nephew. I've reason to believe they may have come this way." Mrs. Paulson opened the door and stepped onto the porch. She did not put the shotgun down. "This is private property, Mr. Hale. Mr. Walker does not receive visitors after dark." A pause. "Mrs. Paulson, isn't it I know you? I knew your husband." "I know you did," she said. Another pause, and this one had a different quality, like something recalculating. "I just want to know if a girl and a small child came past here, that's all. The girl is not well mentally speaking, and the boy is in danger. I'm worried about them." Ruby stood inside the door with Noah pressed against her chest. Listening to Victor's voice-shaped concern, out of nothing smooth and practiced, and utterly convincing if you didn't know what she knew. Noah had gone quiet. He could feel it the way children always could, the charge in the air. "No children have passed this way," Mrs. Paulson said. "Now I suggest you and your men ride back to where you came from before I mistake your presence on this property for a threat." Silence. Then Victor's voice, lower now. "Mrs. Paulson, those children are my legal responsibility. The court has said so." "The court's papers aren't in my hand," she said. "When they are, I'll consider them. Good night, Mr. Hale." She came back inside and shut the door and turned the bolt, and the sound of that bolt sliding home was the most reassuring thing Ruby had heard in days. "He won't leave," Ruby said. "No?" Mrs. Paulson agreed. "He'll camp at the end of the drive and wait for Walker to come back." She set the shotgun against the wall within easy reach and went back to the stove with the composure of a woman who had decided that dinner would not be disrupted by Victor Hale or anyone else. "Which means Mr. Walker will see him when he rides in. Ethan doesn't know how many men Victor brought. Mr. Walker has ridden into harder situations than 4 men in a yard," Mrs. Paulson said. She ladled stew into a bowl and set it in front of Ruby with the air of a woman issuing a directive. "Eat. You'll need your strength." Ruby sat down. She looked at the bowl. She thought about Victor's voice, that particular texture of pleasant reasonableness that he wore over everything like a coat. And she thought about Ethan riding back through the dark, not knowing what was waiting for him. She picked up her spoon. She would need her strength. She intended to use it. Outside, she could hear the distant sound of horses settling in for a wait. Victor was patient. She'd always known that about him. He was the kind of man who could smile while he waited for something to suffer long enough to stop fighting. But Ruby Carter had walked 15 miles in July. Heat, carrying her brother, had handed her only leverage to a stranger on faith, had written the truth out in her own hand and signed it, and she was 12 years old and she was not done yet. She ate her stew. She waited, and when the sound of a single horse came up the road, an hour later, faster than a casual return, the gait of a rider who had seen the camp at the end of the drive and decided not to slow down for it. Ruby set down her spoon and looked at Mrs. Paulson. The woman was already at the window. "It's Walker," she said. "And he's not alone." Ruby stood up. The door opened, and Ethan Walker came through it, and behind him came a lean, gray-haired man in a dark coat, carrying a leather satchel, and moving with the focused energy of someone who'd been given a reason to hurry. "Whitfield filed the motion," Ethan said. He looked at Ruby, and then passed her toward the window facing the road. "I saw Hale's camp, 4 men. "He came to the door," Ruby said. "Mrs. Paulson sent him off." Ethan looked at Mrs. Paulson. Something passed between them. Brief, mutual, the acknowledgement of people who understand each other without needing to say much. "Miss Carter." The gray-haired man set his satchel on the table and extended his hand. His grip was firm and immediate. "James Whitfield, I read your statement on the ride out. It is one of the clearest accounts I have seen from any witness in 22 years of practice." He looked at her directly, without the softening condescension that most adults brought to conversations with children. "The motion has been filed. Judge Renner will hear argument at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning." He opened the satchel and pulled out a sheaf of papers. "I need to prepare you for what Crowder is going to do in that courtroom. We have approximately 7 hours before we need to ride." Ruby pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. "Tell me everything," she said. Whitfield worked through the night like a man who slept was a luxury he'd already decided he couldn't afford. He sat across from Ruby at Ethan's kitchen table, with the letter between them and her written statement beside it, and a third document, Victor's amended petition, laid flat on his left so he could reference all 3 without moving. He asked her questions the way a man drives fence posts one at a time, straight down, testing the ground each time before he moved to the next. "When did you first hear your uncle mention Crowder's name?" 2 weeks after he arrived. He was on the porch talking low, thought I was inside. He said Crowder says the filing's clean, and the judge won't push back if we move fast." Whitfield wrote without looking up. "Did he say the judge's name?" "Renner. He said Renner specifically." A pause in the writing. Brief. Then it continued. "And the letter. You removed it from a locked room. The window latch was loose on the south side. I'd noticed it 3 days before. I waited until Victor rode into town." She kept her voice even. "The letter was in the top drawer of the desk, not even under anything. He wasn't worried about being found out because he didn't think anyone would look." Whitfield set his pen down and looked at her for a moment. "He underestimated you." "Most people do," Ruby said. "I've learned to use that." Ethan, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, said nothing. But Ruby caught the slight shift in his expression, that same thing from earlier that she'd decided was the beginning of pride. Whitfield picked his pen back up. "Crowder will argue the letter is inadmissible because it was taken without authorization." "Can he do that?" Ruby asked. "He can try. I'll argue it falls under the doctrine of necessity, that a minor child acting to protect herself and her ward from documented fraudulent conspiracy had reasonable cause to secure evidence of that conspiracy." He said it in the measured tone of a man who had already argued it successfully in his head. "Judge Renner is a proceduralist. He cares about the letter of the law. That cuts both ways. It means he won't bend rules for Victor, but it also means we need to give him proper legal ground to stand on. And do we have it?" Whitfield looked in the papers, then at Ruby. "We have a letter in Victor Hale's own handwriting promising to convey 60 acres of your father's land to his lawyer as payment for engineering a fraudulent guardianship petition. We have a 12-year-old girl who secured that letter, carried it 15 miles, and gave a written statement so precise and detailed that I could present it as adult testimony without changing a single word." He folded his hands. "Yes, Miss Carter. We have ground." They worked until 2 in the morning. By the time Whitfield finally closed his satchel, Ruby knew exactly what Crowder would ask and exactly how she would answer. She knew where to pause when to speak slowly, how to keep her voice steady when Crowder tried to rattle her. Whitfield had been thorough and unapologetic about it. He'd played Crowder's role himself, coming at her from 3 different angles, pushing on the parts of her account that could be made to look uncertain, and each time she'd held. "One more thing," Whitfield said, standing. "When you're in that courtroom, look at the judge, not at Crowder, not at Victor. Crowder wants you rattled. Victor wants you small. Renner is the only person in that room whose opinion matters. He looked at her hard. "Can you do that?" "Yes, sir," Ruby said. Whitfield nodded, once picked up his satchel and looked at Ethan. "I'll ride ahead and be at the courthouse when it opens. You bring her in at 7:45, not before. I don't want Victor having time to engineer anything in the hallway." Ethan walked him to the door. They spoke low on the porch for a moment, too low for Ruby to hear, and then Whitfield's horse moved away into the dark, and Ethan came back inside. "Get a few hours," he said. "Victor's men are still at the end of the drive," Ruby said. "I know. They won't come onto the property tonight. Victor wants this done in court. He's too careful to do something that could be brought back to him before a judge." Ethan looked at her. "Sleep, Miss Carter. You need your mind clear." Ruby looked at him for a moment. "Are you going to sleep?" "Probably not," he admitted. She almost smiled. "Good night, Mr. Walker." "Good night, Ruby." She lay down on the bed beside Noah and listened to him breathe and stared at the ceiling and told herself to rest, even if she couldn't sleep. The ceiling didn't offer much back. She went over Whitfield's questions in her head, her answers, the places he'd pushed. She thought about the courtroom, a room she'd never been in a town she'd spent most of her life outside of in front of a judge she'd never seen. She thought about her father, Thomas Carter, who had taught her to write and to read and to calculate board feet of timber and to look people in the eye when she talked to them, who had told her once when she was 9, and some older boys had taken her fishing pole as a joke. "Ruby, the world's full of people who think your size means you don't count. The only thing you can do about it is make sure they're wrong." She was asleep before she finished the memory. Ethan woke her at 5:30. She was dressed and had Noah ready in 40 minutes. Mrs. Paulson had coffee and food on the table, and she'd pressed Ruby's dress, or rather the dress that had belonged to her niece, clean now, and fitted reasonably well, and set it on the chair without comment. Ruby changed and ate and held Noah in her lap while he finished his biscuit with the systematic focus of a child who has decided breakfast is serious business. Victor's camp was still at the end of the drive. Ethan came out of this barn with 2 horses saddled and looked down the road toward the camp, and then looked at Ruby. "You ready?" "No," she said honestly, "but I'm going anyway." "Good enough," he said. They rode out. Victor's men saw them immediately. Ruby could feel it. The sudden attention, the shift from waiting to alert, and for a moment she thought they'd try to stop them. But they didn't move. Victor wasn't among them, which meant he was already in Millhaven, already at the courthouse, or already with Crowder, already preparing his version of events. The ride into town took 40 minutes. Ruby held Noah in front of her on the saddle, his small back against her chest, his hands on the pommel. He liked horses. He pointed at things along the road with one chubby finger and named them with the authority of a child, who is not entirely sure of the names but is certain of the importance of naming. "Bird," he said. "That's right," Ruby said. "Bird. Big bird." "Hawk," Ethan said from beside them. Noah considered this. "Hawk," he repeated, trying it out. He seemed satisfied. Ruby watched the road ahead and held her brother and didn't say what she was thinking, which was that this might be the last morning they rode anywhere together as just the 2 of them. After today, it would be settled one way or the other, and if it went wrong, if Whitfield's legal ground wasn't solid enough, if Renner decided that the letter was inadmissible, or that Victor's story was more credible than a 12-year-old girl's, then this morning would be the last morning she'd had free with Noah for a very long time. She tightened her arm around him. He patted her hand absently, still watching the hawk. Millhaven's main street was already moving when they rode in. It was not a large town. A courthouse, a bank, 2 saloons, a dry goods store, a doctor's office, a blacksmith, a small hotel. But it had the particular morning energy of a place where people already knew something was happening. Ruby felt the looks as they rode down the street. Not all of them hostile, some curious, some a few something harder to name. Sympathy, maybe. Or the look people get when they're watching something that matters, and they're not sure which side they're on yet. Whitfield was on the courthouse steps. He looked alert in the way that men who'd been awake all night sometimes looked past tired and into a kind of sharpened focus that was its own sort of energy. "Renner's already in his chambers," Whitfield said, falling into step beside them as they climbed the steps. "Victor and Crowder arrived 20 minutes ago. Crowder filed an objection to our motion last night. He must have had a man watching the clerk's office." He glanced at Ruby. "It won't hold, but it cost us the element of surprise." "What does that mean?" Ruby asked. "It means Victor knows we have the letter." Whitfield held the door. "He'll have prepared for it." They went inside. The courtroom was smaller than Ruby had imagined it. Wood benches, a raised bench at the front, 2 tables facing it. At the left table sat a broad-shouldered man in a brown suit. Crowder, Ruby realized, the Billings lawyer, and beside him, ramrod straight expression pleasantly composed, sat Victor Hale. Victor turned when they came in. His eyes found Ruby, immediately moved to Noah in her arms, moved to Ethan behind her, moved back to Ruby. His expression didn't change. That was the worst part, it never changed. He just looked at her with those patient, calculating eyes and then turned back to face the front of the room. Ruby walked to the right table and sat down and set Noah on her knee. Ethan sat in the front bench directly behind her. She could feel him there, the solidity of it like a wall at her back. "All rise." Judge Renner was a compact man in his late 50s with a close-cut gray beard and eyes that missed nothing. He settled behind the bench, arranged his papers with the deliberateness of a man who controlled the pace of every room he entered, and looked over the assembled parties without expression. "We are here on an emergency motion filed by counsel for the Carter minors to present new evidence and request a continuance of the guardianship hearing currently scheduled for tomorrow morning." He looked at Whitfield. "Counselor." Whitfield stood. "Your Honor, the motion concerns a letter written in the hand of the petitioner, Victor Hale, to attorney Edmund Crowder of Billings, Montana, in which Mr. Hale explicitly promises to convey 60 acres of the Carter estate land belonging to the minor children to Mr. Crowder as direct payment for engineering the guardianship petition before this court. We submit that this letter constitutes evidence of fraud, conspiracy, and direct conflict of interest on the part of both the petitioner and opposing counsel, and that it requires this court to dismiss the current petition with prejudice." The room was very quiet. Crowder was already on his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. The document in question was obtained illegally by a minor child through unauthorized entry into a private room. The child is 12 years old and entered a room in the home of her deceased father to protect herself and her infant brother from a fraudulent legal proceeding," Whitfield said without raising his voice. "The doctrine of necessity applies. The evidence is admissible." Renner held up one hand, and both lawyers went quiet immediately. He looked at Crowder. "Are you appearing in this proceeding, Counselor, given that you are named in the motion as a party to the alleged conspiracy?" A beat of silence. Crowder's jaw worked. "Your Honor, the allegations are baseless." "I asked you a question," Renner said. "Are you appearing as counsel for the petitioner in a proceeding where you are named as an interested party?" Another beat. Longer. Yes, Your Honor. I am continuing to represent." "You are not," Renner said. Simple. Final. He looked at Victor. "Mr. Hale, you will need to secure independent counsel before this proceeding continues. Mr. Crowder, you are excused from this courtroom. If the allegations in this motion are substantiated, you will be hearing from the State Bar." Crowder went pale. He gathered his papers with the stiff, careful movements of a man keeping himself controlled, and he walked out of that courtroom without looking back. Victor's composure cracked just slightly, just at the corners of his eyes, and then it sealed back over. He looked at the judge with the expression of a man switching strategies in real time. "Your Honor, I'd like to address the court directly if I may." "You may," Renner said. Victor stood. He straightened his jacket, and he looked at the judge with the full force of his considerable charm. "My niece is a child who has been under severe emotional strain since the loss of both her parents. What she has presented to this court as evidence is a letter she doesn't fully understand, taken from a room she had no business being in, that has been misinterpreted through the lens of a frightened girl's grief and suspicion. He paused. Let that land. I came to Cimarron Creek because those children had no one else. I am their family. Everything I have done has been out of concern for Mr. Hale. Renner's voice cut through cleanly. I have the letter in front of me. He held it up briefly, then set it down. I am going to read one sentence from it. The sentence reads, once the guardianship is settled, and the children dealt with the timber rights along the eastern boundary, no less than 60 acres will be conveyed in full to your firm as agreed. He looked at Victor over the top of the paper. Explain the phrase the children dealt with. Victor opened his mouth. He closed it. He opened it again. It refers to the guardianship being settled legally, Your Honor. The phrasing is inelegant, but the intent, Renner said, is what concerns me. He set the letter down flat. Sit down, Mr. Hale. Victor sat. Renner looked at Whitfield. I'll hear from the witness. Ruby handed Noah to Ethan. She had to turn and look at him to do it, and when she did, he held her gaze for 1 second with an expression that said everything it needed to, without a single word. She turned back, stood up, and walked to the front of the room. She stood where Whitfield indicated, and she looked at Judge Renner. Not at Victor. Not at the room. Directly at the judge the way Whitfield had told her. State your name, Renner said. Ruby Ann Carter, daughter of Thomas Carter, deceased, and Margaret Carter, deceased. Sister and current caretaker of Noah James Carter, age 2 years. Renner looked at her for a moment. Really looked at her, the kind of look that takes a full measure of someone. How old are you, Miss Carter? 12, Your Honor. And you were the one who secured the letter? Yes, sir. Tell me how. So she told him. She told it the way Whitfield had coached her, direct, sequential, no embellishment, no emotion that didn't belong there. She told him about the loose window latch and the unlocked drawer. She told him what she'd read and how many times she'd read it before she understood all of it. She told him about the night Victor came home laughing and what he'd said, and the moment she understood that waiting was no longer an option. You walked to the Broken Spur Ranch, Renner said. Yes, sir, 15 miles. Carrying your brother? Yes, sir. Renner was quiet for a moment. Something moved in his expression, brief, contained, but there. Mr. Hale has stated in his amended petition that your departure with the child constituted instability and unfit behavior. What do you say to that? Ruby looked at the judge steadily. I say that I learned my uncle had filed papers to take permanent legal control of my brother and our father's land through an agreement that would give our land to my uncle's lawyer as payment. I say that I had 2 days until the hearing and no legal representation, and no one in our town who wasn't connected to Victor Hale. I say that I picked up my brother and I walked until I found someone who would help us. She paused. I don't know what word the court wants to use for that, but it was the most rational thing I've ever done. The room was very quiet. Victor's voice came from the table, low and tightly controlled, the voice of a man who had miscalculated badly and knew it. She is a child, Your Honor. She has been coached. Whatever that rancher told her to, Mr. Hale. Renner did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. You do not have counsel present. I advise you very strongly not to speak again until you do. Victor went silent. Renner looked at Ruby. Do you have anything further to add? Yes, sir. She reached inside the neckline of her dress and pulled out a second folded paper. Not the letter, something else, smaller, older. Her hands were perfectly steady. This is a letter from my mother to Victor Hale, written 2 years before she died. In it, she asks him, as Thomas Carter's brother, to serve as executor of the estate should anything happen to both parents and to protect the children's interest in the land until they came of age. She said it on the edge of the judge's bench. My mother trusted him with that. She used the word protect. Ruby's voice didn't crack. It stayed level and clear and absolutely certain. I would like the court to know what she asked for and what he chose to do instead. Renner picked up their letter. He read it. He set it beside the first letter and looked at both of them together for a long moment. Then he looked at Victor Hale. Victor looked back at him. The pleasantness was gone from his face now. What was left underneath was something harder and less appealing, and Ruby thought, there it is. That's the real face. That's what I've been looking at for 3 months. Your Honor, Victor said very quietly. I was trying to do what was best for Mr. Hale, Renner said. I have in front of me a letter in your hand, promising to convey 60 acres of property belonging to 2 orphan children to the attorney you hired to give you legal control of those children. I have a letter from the children's deceased mother asking you to protect their interests. And I have a 12-year-old girl who walked 15 miles in July heat to prevent you from completing that transaction. He folded his hands on the desk. I am going to recess for 20 minutes. When I return, I will issue my ruling on the emergency motion and the status of the guardianship petition. He stood. Everyone stood. He walked through the door at the back of the room, and it closed behind him. The room stayed standing for a moment in the particular suspended silence of people who have just watched something shift in a direction they didn't expect. Then Victor Hale looked across the room at Ruby and said very quietly, so that only she and Ethan and Whitfield could hear it, You think you've won something? Ruby looked at him. I think the judge has the letters, she said. That's enough. You're 12 years old and you don't have any idea what the law can and can't do. His voice was controlled, but something flickered behind his eyes, something that was very close to the face he'd shown in the kitchen that last night when he'd been laughing. Only this wasn't laughing. Courts take time. Rulings get appealed. Land disputes drag on for years. You think one morning in one courtroom ends this. Ethan stepped up beside Ruby. He didn't say anything. He just stood there between her and Victor, not making a production of it, just present and solid and utterly immovable. Victor looked at him. Something in Victor's expression calculated the distance and came to a conclusion he didn't like. He picked up his hat from the table. I'll find counsel, he said to no one in particular. This isn't over. He walked out. Whitfield watched him go, and then turned to Ruby with an expression that was professionally careful, but not quite able to conceal something deeply satisfied. He's right that today isn't a final ruling, he said. But Renner taking that recess rather than ruling immediately means he's writing an actual opinion, not a quick dismissal. That's significant. Good significant or bad significant? Ruby asked. Judges who are about to side with a fraudulent petition don't take 20 minutes to think about it, Whitfield said. They just rule. Ruby breathed out slowly. Noah had gotten down from Ethan's knee during the recess and was investigating the baseboards with his usual scientific thoroughness. She went and scooped him up and held him against her hip, and he rested his head on her shoulder with the particular contentment of a child who has been well fed and has interesting things to look at and trusts completely that everything is being handled. Whatever happens, she said quietly to Ethan, not to the room. I need you to know if it had gone the other way today, I would have figured out something else. I wouldn't have stopped. Ethan looked at her for a moment. I know that, he said. I knew it the first morning. The door at the back of the room opened. Judge Renner came back in. Everyone stood again. He sat, arranged his papers with the same unhurried deliberateness as before, looked at the room and began to speak. In the matter of the emergency motion filed by counsel for the Carter minors, the motion is granted. The letter entered into evidence constitutes prima facie evidence of fraud and conspiracy to commit property theft. The guardianship petition filed by Victor Hale is dismissed with prejudice. Mr. Hale is further barred from filing any subsequent guardianship petition regarding these minors without leave of this court. He looked at Whitfield. Counselor, I'd like you to remain in chambers after this proceeding to discuss the matter of the attorney Edmund Crowder and the appropriate referral to the state bar. He looked at the room one more time. The Carter children are to remain in appropriate care, pending a formal guardianship arrangement reviewed by this court. Any arrangement proposed must demonstrate that the children's interests, specifically their interest in the estate of Thomas Carter, are protected, not transferred. He paused. Is there a proposed guardian before the court today? Whitfield looked at Ethan. Ethan stood up. He held his hat in both hands. Ethan Walker, Your Honor, of the Broken Spur Ranch 11 miles west of Millhaven. His voice was steady. I'd like to put my name forward if the court will consider it. Renner looked at him, looked at Ruby, looked at Noah, who chose that moment to twist in Ruby's arms, point at the judge with one authoritative finger, and say with great confidence, "Hawk." Renner's expression moved very briefly carefully towards something that was not quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. "The court will consider it," he said. "We'll schedule a review hearing within 30 days. He gathered his papers. "This proceeding is adjourned." The gavel came down. Ruby stood in the middle of the courtroom with her brother on her hip and her heart doing something loud and complicated in her chest. And she looked at Ethan Walker, who was still holding his hat, and looking at the front of the room with the expression of a man who had said the most significant thing he'd said in years and was still catching up to it himself. "Mr. Walker," she said. He looked at her. "Thank you," she said. "Just that. No more." He nodded, slow, deliberate the way he did most things. "Don't thank me yet," he said. 30 days is 30 days. "I know." She shifted Noah on her hip. "But it's 30 days we have." She looked at the door Victor Hale had walked through. "Yesterday we didn't have anything." Outside Millhaven's main street went on about its morning indifferent to what had just happened in the courthouse. But Ruby Carter walked out into the July sun with her brother on her hip, and a lawyer at her side, and a rancher at her back, and she tipped her face up to the heat, and felt it not the weight of it this time, not the pressure, but something closer to light. It wasn't over. Victor had said so, and for once she believed him. Courts took time, land disputes dragged. There would be more mornings like this one. But there would be mornings. That was the thing. There would be mornings, and she would be in them, and so would Noah, and Victor Hale's name was on a piece of paper in a courthouse that now said "dismissed with prejudice" next to it. She walked to where the horses were tied and handed Noah up to Ethan to hold while she mounted, and Noah grabbed 2 fistfuls of Ethan's vest and looked up at him with complete confidence. "Hawk," Noah said again, apparently still thinking about it. "Yeah," Ethan said. Something in his voice had shifted so small most people wouldn't catch it. "Hawk!" He handed the boy back to Ruby and mounted his own horse, and the 3 of them turned toward the road that led back to the broken spur. Victor Hale was still out there. Crowder was still out there. 30 days was still 30 days. But Ruby Carter had walked into a courtroom at 12 years old and told the truth in front of a judge and watched a fraudulent petition get dismissed with prejudice, and the sun was up and her brother was safe against her chest, and she had 30 days to figure out the rest. She nudged her horse forward. That was enough to start with. The ride back to the broken spur was quiet in the way that follows something large, not empty, but full of things that hadn't found words yet. Ruby held Noah against her chest and felt the rhythm of the horse under them and didn't try to talk. Ethan rode beside her without pushing conversation, which she was grateful for. The morning had taken everything she had, and what was left over was something she needed to sit with before she could sort it. Noah fell asleep before they cleared the edge of town. His head dropped against her collarbone, and his breathing went slow and even, and she held him tighter without thinking about it, the way she'd been holding him tighter without thinking about it for 3 months. The 30 days were already running. That was the thing she kept coming back to. Renner had said review hearing within 30 days, and Whitfield had explained on the courthouse steps, briefly precisely because Whitfield did everything briefly and precisely, that a guardianship review was not a formality. Renner would look at Ethan Walker's background, his finances, his reputation in the county, his capacity to provide for 2 children, one of whom was a toddler, and one of whom was a 12-year-old girl with a father's land to eventually inherit. The judge would want to see that the arrangement was genuinely in the children's interest and not simply convenient. "It's a real evaluation," Whitfield had said, "not rubber-stamped. Renner doesn't rubber-stamp things." "Good," Ruby had said. Because she didn't want rubber-stamped. She wanted real. But real meant 30 days of Victor still being out there. Victor with his resources and his contacts and his absolute certainty, even now, even after this morning, that the situation could be recovered. She thought about what he'd said in the courtroom. Courts take time. Rulings get appealed. Land disputes drag on for years. He hadn't been wrong. He'd just been wrong about which of them it would break. Ethan's voice came from beside her, easy and unhurried. "You're thinking loud." Ruby looked over at him. "Sorry." "Don't be. Just whatever it is, say it out loud. Thinking things alone makes them bigger than they are." She considered that. Then, "Victor's going to appeal." "Probably. And the land Daddy's land. Even with the petition dismissed, Victor's not going to just walk away from 160 acres of timber and creek frontage." "No," Ethan said. "He's not. So this morning was important, but it's not finished." "No," Ethan said again. "It's not finished." He looked at the road ahead. "But here's what is true. That petition is dismissed. Crowder is gone. Renner has read both those letters and he's writing an opinion, which means there's a legal record of what Victor tried to do. And Victor, for the first time since your daddy died, is on the defensive." He glanced at her. A man on the defensive is a different kind of problem than a man who thinks he's already won. Ruby thought about that. She thought about Victor in the courtroom before Renner came back, that moment when the pleasantness had finally dropped and she'd seen the real face underneath. The calculated face. The face that was already building the next move. "He'll come back at us from a different angle," she said. "Almost certainly. So we need to be ready for an angle we can't predict yet." "Yes." Ethan looked at her. "Which is why the next 30 days matter as much as this morning did." They rode the rest of the way without talking, and Ruby turned the 30 days over in her mind like a stone she was trying to find the flat side of, and Noah slept against her shoulder all the way home. Mrs. Paulson had known before they got through the door. Ruby wasn't sure how, maybe something in the way they rode in, maybe just the particular instinct of a woman who paid close attention to everything. But she took one look at their faces and said simply, "It went well. Petition dismissed," Ethan said. Mrs. Paulson turned back to the stove. "Good," she said in the tone of someone confirming information they had already arranged their expectations around. Then after a moment, "Sit down, both of you. You look like you've been wrung out." They sat. Mrs. Paulson put food in front of them, and coffee, and didn't ask for details, and Ruby found she was hungrier than she'd realized, and ate without ceremony, while Noah woke up from his saddle sleep, and immediately demanded to be put down, and immediately found the wooden horse, and immediately began a complicated narrative involving the horse, the chair leg, and a biscuit he'd secured from Mrs. Paulson's apron pocket. The afternoon passed in a kind of suspended ordinary, the kind that settles in after crisis and before whatever comes next. Ethan went out to tend stock. Mrs. Paulson cleaned and cooked and moved through the house with her usual deliberate economy. Ruby sat at the kitchen table and wrote. She'd asked for paper, and Ethan had brought her a full sheaf without asking what for, and she wrote out everything she could remember about her father's land. The boundaries, the timber stands, the spring-fed pond, the creek frontage, the access roads, the neighboring properties. Everything Thomas Carter had ever told her, everything she'd absorbed by watching and listening in the years before his death. She wrote it in the careful hand her father had taught her, and she did not stop until she had 12 full pages. When Ethan came back in at dusk, she pushed the pages across the table to him. He sat down and read. All 12 pages without rushing. When he finished, he looked up. "Your daddy taught you all this," he said. "He said a woman who knew the value of what she owned couldn't be cheated out of it," Ruby said. "He started teaching me when I was 8. Ethan was quiet for a moment. He was right. He tapped the pages. "This is the foundation for the land dispute defense. Whitfield needs these." "I know. I'll write a clean copy tomorrow." She paused. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "The review hearing. Renner's going to look at you, your finances, your reputation, all of it." She met his eyes directly. "Is there anything that would give him pause? Anything Victor could find and use?" Ethan didn't look away. "I owe notes on about 40% of this ranch. Land debt, equipment, honest debt, all of it documented, all of it current. Victor could make it look like financial instability if he got the right person to frame it that way." "Whitfield needs to know," Ruby said. "I already told him. On the porch last night while you were inside." He looked at her steadily. I'm not going into this with anything hidden. Whatever Renner looks at, he's going to find what's actually there. Ruby nodded slowly. What about your reputation in town? Something moved across his face, brief, complicated. I keep to myself mostly. Some people find that suspicious. Most don't. He paused. There's one thing. About 3 years ago, there was a dispute with a man named Greer. He claimed I'd taken water rights that belonged to him. It went to county arbitration. I won. The rights were documented in the original land deed, but Greer's still in town, and he still holds it against me. Is he connected to Victor? Not that I know of. He looked at her. But Victor's resourceful. Ruby filed that away. Then we should talk to Greer before Victor does. Ethan blinked, just slightly. You want to go talk to the man who has a grudge against me. I want to understand what he thinks happened and whether there's anything that can be resolved before it becomes a weapon. She looked at him levelly. Whitfield said Renner cares about the letter of the law. If there's something in your record that looks messy, we should know what it looks like and how to address it. The best way to diffuse something Victor might use is to diffuse it first. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. You're 12 years old, he said finally, not as an accusation or a dismissal. More like he kept forgetting and then being reminded. My daddy would have said the same thing, Ruby said, about talking to Greer. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. Yeah, he said. He probably would have. The next morning brought the first sign that Victor was already moving. It came in the form of a boy from town, 14, one of the McAllister kids who rode out to the Broken Spur at 7 in the morning with a message from Whitfield. Ruby was in the yard with Noah when the boy came up the drive, and she had the message in her hand before Ethan made it out of the barn. She read it again. Ethan came to her. What? She handed him the paper. Whitfield's handwriting was precise and angular and wasted no words. Victor has retained new counsel, a man named Aldrich from Helena. Aldrich is connected to the territorial governor's office. He has filed a motion this morning to have the dismissed petition reconsidered on grounds that the presiding judge had insufficient evidence to rule without a full evidentiary hearing. Motion is scheduled for review in 10 days. Come to my office today. Ethan read it. His jaw did the thing Ruby had learned to watch for. Helena, he said. He went all the way to Helena. He told me courts take time, Ruby said. He wasn't bluffing. No. Ethan handed the paper back. He was already thinking she could see it, the particular stillness that in him meant rapid internal calculation. Aldrich connected to the governor's office means political weight. Renner would feel that pressure even if he didn't want to. Can Renner resist it? Renner's a principled man. But principled men feel pressure the same as everyone else, they just handle it differently. He looked at the boy still waiting on his horse. Tell Whitfield we'll be there by 9. The boy turned his horse and rode. Ruby looked at Ethan. Victor's trying to exhaust us, she said. Keep us in court long enough and spend enough money that we can't keep up. That's the play, Ethan agreed. He has more resources. Then we need something he can't outspend. She was already thinking the way she'd been thinking since she was 9 years old, and had learned that thinking carefully was the one advantage that didn't depend on size or money. Witnesses. People who know what Victor actually did, not just the letter people who saw things, heard things. She looked at Ethan. You said more people in this county have something against Victor than he thinks. I said that. Then it's time to find them. Whitfield's office was the organized chaos of a man who handled too many cases and refused to put anything down until he understood exactly where it belonged. He had the motion from Aldrich already annotated when they arrived, margins filled with his precise angular notes, and he looked up when they came in with the expression of a man who had been awake since before the message went out and was running on principle and coffee. Aldrich is good, he said without preamble. Better than Crowder. He doesn't make mistakes in filings, and he knows how to frame a narrative for a judge who's feeling political heat. He looked at Ruby. which means we can't win this on the letter alone anymore." "I know," Ruby said. "We need witnesses." Whitfield looked at her, then at Ethan, then back at Ruby. "You've been thinking about this since the message, since the courtroom yesterday," she said. "Victor told me himself it wasn't over. I believed him." Whitfield leaned back in his chair. "All right, who do we have?" They built the list over the next 2 hours. Ruby knew more than she'd realized. She knew names her father had mentioned, people who'd had dealings with Victor that hadn't gone right. Families in Cimarron Creek who'd felt the pressure of his methods and had nowhere to take it. Ethan added names from his own knowledge of the county the Dunbar family Whitfield had represented 3 years ago. 2 ranchers south of Millhaven who'd had water rights disputes with Hale-connected interests. A grain merchant in town who'd lost a contract under circumstances that had never sat quite right. Mrs. Paulson, who had come into town with them and was sitting in the chair by the window not saying anything, said suddenly, "Agnes Merritt." Everyone looked at her. "She's a school teacher, retired now, Cimarron Creek." Mrs. Paulson folded her hands in her lap, with the air of someone producing something they'd been saving for the right moment. She taught Thomas Carter's children. She was there the night Margaret Carter Ruby's mother signed the letter asking Victor to serve as executor. Agnes Merritt witnessed that letter. The room went very still. Ruby felt it the specific quality of stillness that meant something had just shifted. "She witnessed it," Whitfield said. "She was the one who brought the pen," Mrs. Paulson said. "She told me 2 weeks after Margaret died. She said she'd had a bad feeling about it from the start, but Margaret had been so certain about Victor's good character." Her pale eyes moved to Ruby. "She's been carrying that ever since." Ruby thought about her mother's letter, the one she'd handed to Judge Renner, the one that asked Victor to protect them. Her mother's careful handwriting, the word she'd used. Protect. "Agnes Merritt can testify that the letter was genuine," Ruby said slowly. "That it was written in good faith. That my mother wasn't coerced and wasn't deceived at the time of signing, which means Victor knew exactly what he was trusted with. He knew, and he chose to do the opposite." "Intent," Whitfield said. "That's the legal piece we've been missing. The letter between Victor and Crowder shows the mechanics of the fraud. Agnes Merritt can establish knowing betrayal of explicit trust." He was already reaching for paper. "This changes the evidentiary picture entirely." "Will she testify?" Ethan asked, looking at Mrs. Paulson. "I think she's been waiting for someone to ask," Mrs. Paulson said simply. They rode to Cimarron Creek that afternoon, Ethan and Ruby with Noah settled in a basket on the wagon, and Mrs. Paulson driving, because she knew Agnes Merritt personally and thought a familiar face would help. Ruby sat beside her on the wagon bench and watched the road and thought about her mother. Margaret Carter had been a practical woman. Not cold warm, actually, in the specific way of people who don't waste warmth on performance. She'd believed in Victor because Victor had been Thomas's brother, and Thomas had been the most honest man she'd ever known, and she'd extended that trust by association. She couldn't have known. Ruby had understood that intellectually for months, but sitting on the wagon with Agnes Merritt's name newly in her mind, she felt it differently. Felt the specific sadness of her mother's good faith being the thing Victor had built his plan on top of. She pushed it down. There was time for that later. Right now, there was Agnes Merritt. The retired schoolteacher lived in a small house on the east side of Cimarron Creek, and she opened the door before they'd finished knocking a small white-haired woman in her 70s with sharp dark eyes and the upright posture of someone who had spent decades standing at the front of a classroom. She looked at Mrs. Paulson. She looked at Ruby. She looked at Noah on Mrs. Paulson's hip. Her eyes came back to Ruby. "You're Thomas's girl," she said. "Yes, ma'am." Agnes Merritt looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through her expression, recognition and relief, and the particular guilt of a person who has been waiting to make something right. "I heard about the hearing yesterday," she said. "Word travels fast in a small county." She stepped back from the door. "Come in." They sat in her front room, and Ruby explained what they needed. Agnes listened without interrupting. Her hands folded in her lap, her eyes moving between Ruby and Whitfield's written summary that Ethan held. When Ruby finished, the old woman was quiet for a moment. "I've thought about that night many times," Agnes said. "Your mother was not a woman who asked for help easily. Asking Victor, putting it in writing, having it witnessed, that was significant for her. She trusted him." A pause. "I should have said something sooner. When the petition started circulating, when I heard Victor's name in connection with it, I should have." "You're saying something now," Ruby said. "That's what matters." Agnes looked at her. The relief in her expression was the kind that comes from being met with grace when you expected judgment. "Yes," she said. "I suppose it is." She straightened in her chair. "I'll testify. Everything I remember the night your mother signed what she said, what Victor said, all of it." She looked at Ethan. "You can tell your lawyer I'll be at whatever hearing he needs me at." They rode back toward Millhaven as the light changed and the day started to let go of its heat. Noah had fallen asleep again in the basket, one hand curled around the edge. Mrs. Paulson drove with her usual steady patience. Ethan rode beside the wagon, and Ruby sat on the bench and felt the day settling into her. The motion from Aldrich was still pending. Victor was still out there. 10 days to the reconsidering hearing and 30 days to the guardianship review, and both of those things required more work, more preparation, more staying sharp. But Agnes Merritt would testify. And Whitfield had a new evidentiary angle. And the list they'd built in his office that morning had 7 names on it, 7 people who had something real to say about Victor Hale, who had been waiting, as Mrs. Paulson had said, for someone to ask. "Mr. Walker," Ruby said. Ethan looked over from his horse. "Do you think my daddy would have done what you did?" she asked. "Taken in 2 strangers' children and put his name before a judge for them?" Ethan considered it. He took his time the way he took time with things that deserved it. "I didn't know your daddy," he said finally. "But from what I've read in those 12 pages you wrote, and from what I've heard you say about him, yeah. I think he probably would have." Ruby looked at the road ahead. "I think so too," she said. They rode in silence for a while. Then Ethan said, "For what it's worth, I'm not doing it because I think it's what anyone else would have done. I'm doing it because it's what needed doing." Ruby glanced at him. "My daddy used to say those were the same thing." "Maybe," Ethan said. "Or maybe the difference is that some people see what needs doing and some people don't. Your daddy sounds like the kind of man who always saw." Ruby thought about Thomas Carter, the way he'd looked at fence lines and creek beds, and the faces of the people he dealt with, all with the same careful, honest attention. The way he'd looked at her, the way he'd said her name. Ruby. Like it was something solid. "He did," she said. "He always saw." 3 days before the reconsidering hearing, Whitfield sent word that Aldrich had filed a supplementary motion, a request that the court appoint an independent guardian ad litem for the children during the legal proceedings, a neutral third party whose sole obligation would be to represent the children's interests. Ruby read the message twice and then said to Ethan, "He's trying to remove you from the equation." Ethan took the message and read it. "A guardian ad litem appointed by the court would be independent of me," he said slowly. "They'd be neutral theoretically. Victor's argument would be that as someone seeking permanent guardianship, I have a conflict of interest. And if the court appoints someone Victor has influence with, then the person theoretically advocating for you and Noah is actually reporting back to Victor." Ethan set the message down. "It's a clean move. Can Whitfield block it? He can argue against it. Whether Renner agrees," he stopped. "We need to get to Whitfield today." They were in Whitfield's office within the hour. The lawyer read the supplementary motion, and then set it down with the expression of a man who was genuinely annoyed, which Ruby had not seen on him before. It was oddly reassuring. It meant the move was actually dangerous. "Aldrich is thorough," Whitfield said. "I'll give him that." He tapped the motion. "The guardian ad litem request is procedurally legitimate. Renner could grant it without it being a sign that he's siding with Victor. It's the kind of thing judges do when a case has this many moving parts." He looked at Ruby. "Which means we can't simply argue against it. We need to propose someone specific, someone Renner will trust who has no connection to Victor and who we trust completely." Ruby looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at Ruby. They both looked at Whitfield. Dr. Calloway, Ruby said. Whitfield blinked. Then, the man rode out to Walker's ranch at 9 o'clock at night to treat a child he'd never met. He told me he'd been practicing for 38 years, and he didn't generally recall the details of house calls, Ruby said. He's nobody's man, and Renner knows him. Whitfield was quiet for a moment. Then he reached for paper. Yes, he said simply. Calloway. He wrote to Dr. Calloway that afternoon. The doctor's response came back the same evening, a single line in his cramped, efficient handwriting. I've been a doctor in this county for 31 years. The Carter children are patients of mine. I'll serve. Ruby held that paper and felt the ground under them solidify by one more degree. It was fragile still. It was careful and provisional, and there were 10 days to the hearing and 30 days to the review, and Victor Hale had a lawyer from Helena with connections to the governor's office, and he was not done. She knew that. She held no illusions about it. But Agnes Merritt would testify. 7 witnesses had names on a list. Dr. Calloway would serve as guardian ad litem. And Whitfield was awake in his office right now, writing a response to Aldrich's motion that would lay out every piece of that in the clean, precise language that Judge Renner trusted. Ruby put Dr. Calloway's note in the front of her dress, beside the place where the letters had been. She went back to the Broken Spur with Ethan and Noah and Mrs. Paulson, and she ate dinner and helped Noah with his bath and put him to bed and sat beside him in the dark until his breathing went even and deep, and then she sat a little longer. Thomas Carter's daughter, Margaret Carter's daughter, the girl who had walked 15 miles in July heat because she refused to let the alternative happen. She was still that girl. She intended to keep being that girl for as long as it took. She stood up, careful not to wake Noah, and went to find Ethan. He was on the porch the way he often was in the evening, sitting on the step, not doing anything particular, just being present in the way he had of being present. She sat on the step beside him. "Tomorrow," she said. "Can we go talk to Greer?" Ethan looked at her sideways. "You didn't forget about that." "I don't forget things," she said. "My daddy said a good memory was half of any negotiation." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then something moved across his face. That thing she'd been watching for days that she'd decided early on was the beginning of pride. Only now it had grown into something fuller and less careful. Something that looked in the half-dark of a Montana summer evening remarkably like the face of a man who had discovered against all expectation that he was not as alone as he'd gotten used to being. "Yeah," he said. "We can go talk to Greer." Ruby nodded, looked out at the yard. "Good," she said. "Then we're still ahead of him." Greer was not what Ruby expected. She had built a picture of him in her mind. A hard man, bitter, the kind that carried a grudge like a weapon he kept polished. What she found when Ethan drove the wagon to the small spread south of Millhaven was a tired man in his late 50s with dirt under his fingernails, and the look of someone who had been fighting something for a long time and was running out of reasons to keep fighting it. He came to the door when he heard them pull up and stood on his porch with his arms crossed and looked at Ethan, the way men look at people they've decided not to like anymore. "Walker," he said. "Greer." Ethan climbed down from the wagon. He didn't put his hand out. He seemed to understand instinctively that a handshake offered too early would be refused, and a refused handshake would set the wrong tone. "I need to talk to you." "About what?" "About Victor Hale." Something shifted in Greer's posture. Not warmth, not yet, but the shift of a man whose attention has been caught by a name he wasn't expecting. His eyes moved to Ruby still on the wagon bench and to Noah on her hip. "Who's the girl?" "Ruby Carter," Ruby said. "Thomas Carter's daughter. Victor Hale tried to steal our land through a fraudulent guardianship petition. Judge Renner dismissed it 2 days ago." She kept her voice direct and even. "He's already filed a motion to have the ruling reconsidered. He's not done, and we need people who know what kind of man he actually is." Greer looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Ethan. "You brought a 12-year-old to make your argument for you. She makes it better than I do," Ethan said simply. Something moved in Greer's face, reluctant almost against his will. He unfolded his arms. "Come up then," he said. "I'll hear it." They sat on Greer's porch, and Ruby talked, and Greer listened, and Ethan stayed quiet, which was the right thing to do. Greer had no grudge against Ruby, had no grudge against the Carter name at all, and Ruby could see him processing the water rights dispute with Ethan separately from what she was telling him, holding them in different parts of his mind. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Hale," he said finally. "I know that name. He bought up Henderson's grazing lease 2 years back. Henderson told me Hale's man showed up with paperwork that looked legal, and Henderson couldn't afford a lawyer to read it properly." He looked at Ethan. "Same pattern." "Same pattern," Ethan agreed. Greer rubbed the side of his jaw. "The water rights thing, between you and me." He looked at the yard, not at Ethan. "I knew the deed was in your favor. I knew it when the arbitration went the way it did. I was in a bad season, and I needed that water access, and I was angry at the outcome instead of angry at the actual problem." He paused. "Which was that I'd bought land with a bad water claim, and I knew it going in and hoped it wouldn't matter." Ethan looked at him. "I know," he said. "I've known that for 3 years." Greer looked up. "And you never said?" "Wasn't my place." Another pause. Longer. Greer looked at Ruby. "What do you need from me specifically?" "A statement," Ruby said. "Written, signed. About Henderson, about anything else you've seen or heard connected to Hale's methods. Whitfield, our lawyer, will tell you what form it needs to take." Greer nodded slowly. Then he looked at Ethan again. Something in his expression had changed. Not erased, but different. Thinner. Like something that had been held very tight was releasing by degrees. "I'll do it," he said. "Not for you, Walker. For the girl and her brother." "That's fine," Ethan said. "That's plenty." They drove back toward Millhaven with one more name converted from liability to asset, and Ruby sat on the wagon bench and let herself feel the small satisfaction of a problem that had been addressed before it became a weapon. Her father had said that too, the best time to diffuse something is before it's lit. She was learning every day how much her father had been right about. The reconsidering hearing came on a gray Tuesday morning, 8 days after the first ruling. Aldrich was everything Whitfield had warned: precise, measured, professionally unruffled, with the particular confidence of a man who had argued cases in rooms that mattered and knew how to make a judge feel the political weight of a decision without ever being crude enough to mention it directly. He was tall, silver-haired, and he addressed Judge Renner with the practiced deference of someone who had learned exactly how much respect a judge required and never gave more or less. Ruby sat beside Whitfield at the right table and watched Aldrich and thought, "He's very good." And then, "But he doesn't have what we have." What they had was Agnes Merritt. The retired school teacher walked into that courtroom like a woman who had been waiting her whole life to say something important and had finally been given the room to say it. She was 73 years old, white-haired, straight-backed, and she sat in the witness chair with her hands folded and her dark eyes fixed on Judge Renner, with the comfortable authority of a woman who had spent 50 years being the person in the room that children were required to listen to. She told the story of the night Margaret Carter signed the letter. She told it simply, without embellishment. Every detail precise. The kitchen table. The pen she'd brought, the exact words Margaret had used when she'd explained what she was asking Victor to do. "I'm asking him to protect my children. He's Thomas's blood. He knows what that land means to this family." And Victor Hale was present, Whitfield said. "He was sitting right across from her," Agnes said. "He heard every word. He said—" She paused, and in the pause, Ruby could see her reaching back 38 months to a kitchen she'd sat in on a winter night. "He said, Margaret, you have my word. Those children will never want for anything while I'm breathing." The courtroom was very quiet. Whitfield let the silence sit for exactly the right number of seconds. "Thank you, Mrs. Merritt," he said. "No further questions." Aldrich stood for cross-examination. He was careful with Agnes, careful in the way you're careful with something that could hurt you if you handled it wrong. He questioned the precision of her memory, the distance of time, the possibility of misremembering details. Agnes answered each question with the patient clarity of a woman who had spent decades explaining things to people who weren't listening well enough and had simply learned to say it again more slowly. "Mrs. Merritt," Aldrich said, "isn't it possible that your interpretation of Mr. Hale's words at that meeting reflects your current understanding of events, rather than what was actually communicated at the time?" Agnes looked at him. "Young man," she said pleasantly, "I was a schoolteacher for 50 years. I know the difference between what someone says and what someone means. And I know when someone who has just been trusted with something precious looks across a table and makes a promise with his mouth while his eyes are already somewhere else." She paused. Victor Hale's eyes were already somewhere else. Aldrich sat down. Ruby looked at Whitfield. Whitfield looked at his papers, but the corner of his mouth had done something small and satisfied. Dr. Calloway testified next as the appointed guardian ad litem. He was not a witness in the traditional sense, but Renner had asked him to present his assessment of the children's current welfare and the suitability of the proposed arrangement. Calloway stood and said in his direct and unhurried way that Noah Carter was fully recovered, that Ruby Carter was physically sound, and mentally one of the sharpest young people he had encountered in 31 years of practice, and that in his professional assessment, the Broken Spur Ranch under Ethan Walker's stewardship represented a stable, appropriate, and genuinely beneficial environment for both children. "And the proposed permanent guardianship?" Renner asked. "I support it without reservation," Calloway said. "And I'd note for the record that the child was brought to Walker's ranch by her own choice on foot at considerable risk to herself, specifically because she judged it to be safer than remaining with the petitioner." He looked at the judge. "I've been practicing medicine for 31 years. I have some experience in assessing judgment. The girl's judgment was correct." Victor, sitting at the left table with Aldrich, did not look at Ruby. He hadn't looked at her once since the hearing began. She noticed it. She thought it meant he understood finally that looking at her was not something he could do neutrally anymore. Aldrich made his arguments. He was professional and thorough, and he hit every procedural point cleanly: the question of evidentiary standards, the question of the letter's admissibility, the question of whether Renner's original ruling had allowed sufficient time for a full hearing. He was, as Whitfield had said, better than Crowder. He made a real case. But he didn't have Agnes Merritt's testimony. He didn't have 7 signed statements. He didn't have Calloway's professional assessment. He didn't have a 12-year-old girl who had walked 15 miles in July heat and then sat in a courtroom and told the truth without flinching. Renner recessed for 45 minutes. Ruby sat at the table and didn't move. Ethan sat in the front bench behind her with Noah on his knee. Noah had gotten a biscuit from somewhere Ruby suspected Mrs. Paulson, who was in the bench beside Ethan, and was occupied with it entirely. The courtroom murmured around them that particular low sound of people waiting. Whitfield leaned close. "Whatever happens in the next 45 minutes, he said quietly, you should know that what you built in the last 10 days, the witnesses Calloway, the land documentation, that is not the work of a child. That is the work of someone who understands how to fight a strategic battle." Ruby looked at him. "My daddy taught me," she said. "Your daddy taught you well." She looked at the front of the room. "Will it be enough?" Whitfield was quiet for a moment. "Aldrich is good," he said. "But the letter is real. The testimony is real. Renner is a man who respects evidence over pressure." He paused. "I think it will be enough. But I've been wrong before." Ruby nodded. She turned and looked at Ethan. He met her eyes over Noah's head, steady, quiet, the same way he'd met her eyes at the fence that first morning when she'd been trying to decide whether to trust him. She turned back to face the front of the room. The door opened. Renner came back in 18 minutes early. Everyone stood. He settled at the bench. He did not arrange his papers with his usual deliberateness. He looked at the room directly and began. "In the matter of the motion to reconsider, the motion is denied. Clean. No preamble. The evidence presented at the original hearing, supplemented by testimony received today, establishes a clear and documented pattern of fraudulent intent on the part of the original petitioner. The guardian ad litem's assessment supports the stability of the current arrangement. This court finds no legal basis for reconsidering a ruling that was correctly made. He looked at Aldrich. Counsel, I would encourage you to advise your client carefully about the risks of further litigation in this matter. The evidentiary record is not in his favor and is not likely to improve. Aldrich's expression did not change. He was too professional for that. But something went out of his posture, something subtle, the release of a sustained effort that had not landed. Victor Hale stood up. Your Honor, Mr. Hale. Renner's voice cut through without volume. You do not have the floor. He looked at Victor steadily. I will also note for the record that this court has referred the matter of Edmund Crowder to the State Bar, and that the documentation in this case has been forwarded to the Territorial Prosecutor's Office for review of potential criminal charges related to conspiracy and fraud. If you have counsel's advice about what that means for your current legal exposure, I suggest you follow it. Victor sat down. He sat down, and Ruby watched him do it. Watch the careful, pleasant composure finally go rigid. Watch the patient calculation in his eyes become something harder and less certain. And she thought, there it is. That's the moment he understands, it's done. In the matter of the guardianship review, Renner continued, this court approves the permanent guardianship of Ruby Ann Carter and Noah James Carter to Ethan Walker of Harlan County, Montana, effective immediately. The children's interest in the estate of Thomas Carter is to be preserved intact until Ruby Carter reaches the age of majority, at which point the estate reverts to her direct control. Any attempt to encumber, transfer, or diminish that estate prior to that date will be considered a violation of this court's order. He looked at Ethan. Mr. Walker, do you understand the terms of the guardianship? Ethan stood. Yes, Your Honor. And you accept them? I do. Renner looked at Ruby. Something in his expression, that same careful, contained thing she'd seen the first day, moved toward warmth. Just briefly. Miss Carter, this court notes for the record that your conduct throughout these proceedings has been exemplary. Your father's estate is protected. Your brother is safe. A pause. Your father would be proud. Ruby stood. Her voice came out steady. Thank you, Your Honor. The gavel came down, and that was the end of Victor Hale. Not all at once, the Territorial Prosecutor's review took 4 months, and the State Bar proceedings against Crowder took longer. But from the moment that gavel came down, Victor Hale ceased to be a threat. The criminal referral meant he spent the next 6 months with his own legal exposure to manage, and a man managing his own exposure doesn't have the resources or the nerve to keep pressing a case he's already lost twice in court. He left Billings in the spring. Ruby heard through Whitfield a year later that he'd gone to Oregon. She didn't look for more information than that. She didn't need it. The 30 days after the hearing were the quietest Ruby had experienced in months. Not empty full, actually, of the specific busyness of a life being rebuilt. Whitfield handled the estate documentation, the formal transfer of the guardianship papers, the protective order around the Carter land. Dr. Calloway came out to the ranch twice, once for a routine visit, and once because Noah had gotten into something in the barn and needed his hand looked at, which turned out to be minor, but gave Calloway an excuse to stay for dinner, which Ruby suspected was the actual point. Mrs. Paulson came every morning the way she always had, and the routine of the house settled around Ruby and Noah like something that had been waiting for them. Noah learned the name of every horse in Ethan's barn. He learned them in the particular way of 2-year-olds, with complete confidence and moderate accuracy, so that the gray mare became Cloud, regardless of her actual name, and the old bay gelding became Big Hawk, in honor of the hawk on the road that first morning, a name that Ethan allowed to stand without argument. Noah also learned the word reckon from Ethan, and deployed it constantly and mostly incorrectly. And he learned that Mrs. Paulson's apron pocket was a reliable source of biscuit, and that the wooden horse on the shelf was the finest object in the known world. He was in all the ways that mattered safe. He was whole. He was 2 years old, and he knew the names of horses, and he laughed at things, and he slept through the night in a bed that was his, and he did not know yet all of what had been done to keep him there. Ruby knew. Ruby would always know. And she decided in the quiet of those 30 days that this was the right distribution, that the weight of what they'd come through belonged to her, and that Noah's job right now was simply to be 2 years old and laugh and sleep and name horses wrong. She wrote to Whitfield formally, 3 weeks after the second ruling, thanking him for his representation and asking what she could do from the ranch to assist in the ongoing proceedings against Crowder. Whitfield wrote back that she had already done the essential work and that the prosecutor's office had everything they needed, but that her written account might be requested as supporting documentation at a later date. He closed the letter with a single additional line. "If you ever find yourself interested in the law, Miss Carter, I hope you'll remember this office." She read that line twice. Then she folded the letter and put it away in the box she'd started keeping letters and documents related to everything that had happened, organized in the careful, precise way her father had organized the ranch accounts. A record. A history. The proof that it had happened and how it had ended. She didn't write back to Whitfield that day, but she thought about what he'd said for a long time after. The land at Cimarron Creek had to be managed. That was a practical reality that came into focus once the legal emergency had passed. 160 acres didn't manage itself, and Ruby was 12 and living 11 miles away. Ethan rode out with her one Saturday in August to walk the boundary lines and look at the timber stands and sit by the spring-fed pond her father had loved, and Ruby walked the land her father had walked and felt the particular complicated weight of inheriting something you weren't old enough to carry yet, but would be. "It's good land," Ethan said. "The best land my daddy ever saw," Ruby said. "He told me that the week we moved there. He said, 'Ruby, I found the piece of Montana that was waiting for us.'" She looked at the pond. "I believed him then. I believe him still." Ethan looked at her. "When you're of age," he said, "it'll be yours fully. Everything Renner ordered the estate stays intact." "I know." She looked at the water. "I'm going to study law," she said. It was the first time she'd said it out loud, and it came out with the particular certainty of something that has been decided in private for long enough that saying it out loud is just confirmation. Whitfield said, but I'd been thinking about it since before he said anything. Since the first morning in that courtroom. She looked at Ethan. "I want to be able to do what Whitfield did. For people who don't have anyone. For people whose letters don't get read and whose names don't get spoken in the right rooms." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the pond, then back at her. "Then that's what you'll do," he said, simply. The way he said things that he meant completely. "It'll take years," she said. "School, then I don't know where. Helena maybe, or further." "It'll take what it takes," he said. "The land will be here when you're done. Noah will be here. The broken spur will be here." Ruby looked at him. "And you." He didn't hesitate. "And me," he said. She nodded, looked back at the pond, listened to the summer sounds, the creek running, the cottonwood leaves moving, a hawk somewhere high and patient, turning circles in the white July sky. She thought about the morning she'd come over the south ridge holding Noah, her boots bleeding through the leather, her body at the outer edge of what it could do, and the moment she'd seen Ethan Walker standing at the fence with his hands open. She'd made the calculation in that moment, the same calculation she'd been making for 3 months, and the calculation had said, "Move forward. There is nothing behind you worth going back to. Move forward." She had moved forward, and here was where it had brought her. Here was Ethan Walker, who had opened his hands, and then his house, and then his name, before a judge. Here was Mrs. Paulson, who had stood on a porch with a shotgun and told Victor Hale that this house was not undefended. Here was Dr. Calloway, who came out to the ranch more often than strictly necessary, and stayed for dinner, and argued with Ethan about cattle breeds in the comfortable way of men who have decided they like each other. Here was Agnes Merritt, who had been waiting 38 months to say something important, and had finally been given the room to say it. Here was Noah, who called the gray mare Cloud and the old bay Big Hawk, and had recently learned to say reckon and used it to describe everything. Here was a family. Not the one she'd been born into, not the one she'd lost, but a family all the same, made from necessity and stubbornness and the specific grace of people who saw what needed doing and did it without waiting to be asked. She was 12 years old. She had walked 15 miles in July heat and stood in a courtroom and told the truth and watched fraudulent papers get dismissed with prejudice. And she was 12 years old, and she was not done yet. She would study law. She would come back to this land and understand it fully and manage it, and someday hand it on. She would watch Noah grow up knowing his name and his father's name and the name of the land that was his. She would remember every person who had stood beside her in the 30 days that changed everything, and she would carry them the way she'd carried Noah over that ridge carefully, without stopping, all the way home. She picked up a flat stone from the pond's edge and held it in her palm. Her father used to do this: pick up a stone and hold it and say, "Ruby, you can feel the whole history of a place in one piece of rock if you hold it long enough." She held it. Then she set it back at the water's edge, exactly where she'd found it. "All right," she said. "Let's go home." Ethan touched 2 fingers to the brim of his hat, and they walked back across the Carter land together, and Ruby Carter carried nothing heavier than the certainty of what came next, and that she had long since learned was not heavy at all. Ruby Carter had arrived at a stranger's fence with nothing but her brother and the truth had been enough.